Romanticism was a philosophical and artistic movement that gained prominence in Europe from 1750 to around 1900, forming in reaction to the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution, where the rational, technological, and scientific dominated the cultural and intellectual landscape. While differing in subject matter across different countries and regions, it focused mainly on individuality, subjectivity, beauty in nature, and emotional expression over reason and rationality, often exalting extreme emotional states such as passion and despair. One of the most popular archetypes from this era is the romantic hero, which refers to a character who rejects established norms and conventions and has been rejected by society, with a focus on the character's inner emotions and turmoil more so than their actions. As Romanticism developed, we saw the rise of transcendentalists who focused on human virtue and spirituality, and the dark romantics who reacted against this by focusing on evil, self-destruction, suffering, and pessimism, as well as ghouls, ghosts, and goblins. While aspects of Romanticism have certainly been around long before the Romantic movement, and have certainly lasted since the Romantic movement ended, it was replaced by realism later on. The idea that certain human experiences, such as mental illness, shouldn't be romanticized in art and so on, has really gained a lot of traction over the past decade, particularly in response to internet subcultures that express this art style. In this video, I'll be exploring why people like romanticized depictions of mental illness in art, the positive and negative elements of this phenomenon, what critics mean when they use this term, how social media complicates everything, and how this idea has been used to promote censorship, and what I think alternative options to it are, as well as how I think this art style can be a positive aspect to your emotional development as a human being. And with that being said, I guess we should start with what exactly it is that people mean when they say that something romanticizes mental illness. So the definition of romanticizing is to deal with or describe in an idealized or unrealistic fashion, to make something seem better or more appealing than it really is. For example, the tendency to romanticize non-industrial societies. With this definition, we can extrapolate that anything that depicts positively any elements of suffering or mental illness past what is realistic would be a romanticization of said suffering or illness. But when it comes to the accusation, which usually is used in a pejorative sense, that a piece of artwork romanticizes mental illness or suffering, it's very subjective on the critic, I've found, and there's a lot of ambiguity to it. People are very selective about what it is they think is a harmful romanticization and what they think is okay. People have used this term to imply that showing mental illness through a character that is beautiful is automatically romanticized, or that if someone attractive sings about their problems, this is automatically a glorification of whatever issues they are dealing with. When it comes to the social aspect, a lot of people use this term to imply that people are faking suffering for validation and attention, or using mental illness as an aesthetic without concern for the dark realities of the conditions they are appropriating. People have also used this term to criticize media that depicts romantic views of addiction or suicidality, even when it is balanced with blunt and stark depictions of said conditions in a way that very few could argue is glorification. One of my biggest issues around the discourse of romanticization, again, is the subjective nature of it. I see it used all the time to immediately dismiss any media that depicts mental health whatsoever, simply because the person criticizing it is uncomfortable with that artwork. By writing something off as glamorizing an issue, which we've culturally decided is bad, it's easier to not have to deal with those deeper aspects of the human psyche. Overall, though, people use this term in the way that the definition suggests. It's showing the positive or glorifying certain aspects of mental illness without also showing the dark realities. So why do people romanticize mental illness in art and in life? So I think there are two main reasons why people create and consume romantic depictions of mental illness in art, and that is number one, the feeling that it's more authentic, that mental illness or suffering makes a piece of artwork more authentic, and the other one is straight up as a coping mechanism. And so I guess I'll begin with the first one and what I mean with the authenticity term. So in the same way that the Romantic era was a reaction against the industrialization of man, they felt like rationality was taking away what it meant to be truly human, which is to be a very passionate and emotional person. We've also seen nods towards romanticism anytime people are fed up with dominant culture, such as the backlash to consumerism or to the increased feminization of society and lack of established gender roles. When it comes to the artwork of the mentally ill, this ebbs and flows in popularity, both because of its emotional expressionism, as well as the fact that it usually comes from subcultures or people who are marginalized from society and are therefore not a part of the mainstream. And one way we saw this romanticization take place in the modern era is in the 1940s French movement of art brut, which is an art movement that focuses on work from mental patients, prisoners, and other outsiders who aren't influenced by the art world or broader culture. The artist and art collector Jean Dubuffet describes the movement as those works created from solitude and from pure and authentic creative impulses, where the worries of competition, acclaim, and social promotion do not interfere, are, because of these very facts, more precious than the productions of professionals. After a certain familiarity with these flourishings of an exalted feverishness lived so fully and so intensely by their authors, we cannot avoid the feeling that in relation to these works, cultural art in its entirety appears to be the game of a futile society, a fallacious parade. He viewed the artwork of schizophrenics and drug addicts and the like as being more pure because they're not tainted by dominant culture, because they don't fit into dominant culture. And a lot of these people, such as prisoners and mental patients, don't really have much contact with the outside world anyway. And because they aren't professional artists to begin with, it just seems more like an authentic human expression. It's not tainted by any sort of learning. And so in that sense, I feel like that's as pure of an example of romanticizing mental illness as you can get. But a reason that outsider art will always be compelling is simply from the statistical fact that people who deviate from the norm are likely to view things in a different way than the mainstream will. If you're schizophrenic, you literally see things that aren't there, and at times when people are fed up with the broader popular culture, they're even more likely to look towards subcultures or individuals who don't fit in and view their experience as more authentic and less influenced by society. And when it comes to the more common mental conditions like depression and so on, I think people view sad art created by depressives as more authentic and real than artwork created by others because they simply live in that emotion longer. And because that's kind of the landscape of their life, they can explore those familiar emotions more deeply and articulate aspects of the human experience that may be more fleeting for other people. So while everyone experiences sadness and bouts of depression, if someone is chronically in that state and happens to be an artist, it makes sense that they are more likely to be able to express those emotions in a compelling way that broader society can benefit from. Which brings me into the next reason why people create and consume romanticized art, which is using it as a coping mechanism. I think the vast majority of people can relate to using certain art forms, such as music, as a way to cope or to feel catharsis after you're going through some kind of emotional experience in your life, whether it's listening to heartbreak songs and crying after someone breaks up with you, or listening to really angry screamo music when you're so angry that you can't take it. But the same thing is true for people who are struggling with longer-lasting forms of depression and anxiety. Art making has long been utilized as a therapeutic process for people dealing with trauma, mental illness, or addiction, as it provides an emotional outlet for how they feel and provides meaning and narrative to the problems they are facing. When it comes to romantic depictions, or idealized and unrealistic depictions of mental illness or negative emotional states, this can be used by the artist to add meaning and beauty to an otherwise unbearable and bleak state of being. Every person has an emotional need for ontological security, which is a sense of order and continuity to our experiences, and to feel positive and stable in our feelings. Taking our pain and illness and creating a romantic vision out of it helps us to mitigate chaos and anxiety and to find positive elements in our sense of self, even when on the whole an affliction is negative. People seem to want people who are in pain to find beauty in other ways, but sometimes if your whole landscape is dark, you kind of have to romanticize elements of it in order to have feelings of positivity and stability in your life, in your sense of meaning, and in your identity. Romanticized visions of mental illness is also a communication device to broader society because people are more likely to actually consider these emotional states when they're beautiful and more palatable than they would otherwise, which I guess is just a hard truth about reality. Things like The Sorrows of Young Werther or 13 Reasons Why, both of which I'll talk about later on in this video, give you permission and an outlet to express emotions and thoughts that are otherwise unacceptable to express, even if said thoughts are toxic. Who hasn't wanted to die after a heartbreak or losing a loved one? Who hasn't fantasized about how people will react when you're gone? The discomfort around a lot of this art isn't just about the art, but about the nature of human beings as well. When it comes to the romantic hero as well, people often use this claim when it comes to people who romanticize mentally ill artists in the real world and claim that people gloss over the darker aspects of who someone is and maybe glorify their suicide in a way that people feel like is harmful. And I am eventually going to do a video on the tortured artist, and I'm going to look at the science between creativity and neurosis. But as it relates to romanticizing mental illness, I want to touch on the martyrization of certain public figures. As stated earlier, the idea of the romantic hero refers to an unconventional character who has been rejected by society, whose portrayal emphasizes inner feelings and turmoil with a focus on emotional extremism. Outside of fiction, we also see people martyrize and romanticize mentally ill artists for complicated and nuanced reasons. One of the most famous instances of this in history was with the death of the young poet Thomas Chatterton in 1770, whose artistry and suicide inspired some of the most important and prolific romantic artists from that period. His was the OG romanticized suicide. And even today, people will martyrize tortured artists because they kind of represent the failings of society, as well as those artists are a mouthpiece for so many people who maybe aren't artists themselves or don't feel like broader society understands them, and this person kind of represents a lot of their emotional life. And so when that person ends their life, yeah, there's the anger at society, but there's also just kind of a mix of gratefulness to it. Like when anyone dies, you kind of just like immediately start reflecting on them and their lives. And so a lot of this martyrization is kind of like asserting how grateful you are for the life and legacy that they lived. And I'm not saying this is a fully healthy coping mechanism, but I am saying that it's a mechanism that is very common within people. But to continue on with the historical controversies around romanticizing mental illness in art, I also want to talk about how this has been used historically to enact censorship. And with that, I'll bring us back to the 1700s with the Sorrows of Young Werther. One of the most influential works within the broader Romanticism movement was a book written by Goethe in 1774 called The Sorrows of Young Werther. In this book, Werther longs for a woman who doesn't requite his love and ends his life in despair. It was an immediate success, and people began dressing as Werther, and panic arose in several countries over copycat suicides, the extent or validity of which is unclear. Even today, when it comes to suicide contagion and copycats from media, there isn't a lot of very clear or definitive evidence for this, but what has been established is that most copycat suicides occur within peer networks rather than as a response to the media, and that celebrity suicides had the highest effect on potential copycats when it came to media factors. And when it comes to suicides ruled as copycats or as part of a larger contagion, this represents a very tiny minority of cases and doesn't exist absent of greater factors that make someone prone to ideation and completed attempts. And when it comes to a lot of criticisms of romanticized depictions of mental illness in art, a lot of people think that by making mental illness look cool, people are going to mimic those behaviors, even really harmful behaviors. And I am going to talk about this more in the social media section of this video because it is kind of complicated. But we've seen the idea of fiction pushing people into suicide as a means to enact censorship all throughout history, as well as artists and artwork being used as a scapegoat for more deeply nuanced issues such as suicide. The Sorrows of Young Werther was banned in several countries, and sometimes it was illegal to even dress like the main character. This report of a death blaming the book from 1784 reminds me heavily of the testimony brought up by American senators to advocate for the censorship of Marilyn Manson that I talked about in my third installment of Defending Transgressive Art. The obituary states, "The sorrows of Werther were found under her pillow, a circumstance which deserves to be known in order, if possible, to defeat the evil tendency of that pernicious work." This is similar to the parent testifying to Congress that Marilyn Manson was the cause of his son's suicide because he was listening to his music at his time of death. And while I'm not criticizing this parent or anyone who's had to deal with the loss of a loved one, but again, I think it's very reductive to simplify someone's suicide as just being caused by the artwork that they consume. Yes, if you're depressed, you're more likely to be listening to that kind of artwork, but correlation doesn't equal causation there. The effect of TV shows and music when it comes to suicidality is literally so small. Like, are we not going to pretend like it's mostly substance abuse, peer relationships, chemical imbalances, like all kinds of things, environmental factors, like, it's not the music, love. But if we do accept that fiction can induce maladaptive coping behaviors or cause people to wallow in their depression, we also have to accept that it can have a positive effect as well, particularly when it comes to coping with negative emotions or on suicide prevention itself. There was a study done on the series 13 Reasons Why by Northwestern University, though funded by Netflix, which is pretty fishy, that highlights positive outcomes from viewership, such as an increase in conversations between teens and parents about bullying, suicide, and mental health, as well as increased empathy for peers and an increase in information sought out for suicide prevention. Outside of this study as well, there's plenty of personal anecdotes from people who have seen this show or other shows where they claim that it's helped broaden their views of mental illness or has even prevented them from falling into self-harm or contemplating suicide and so on because of how it's depicted and because they're able to empathize with these characters even if it is through a romantic lens. And if you're unaware, 13 Reasons Why was a show that was popular a few years back that romanticized mental illness and suicide and was basically an exploration of the teenage or depressed adult fantasy of people being sorry when you're gone. In the show, Hannah Baker is able to see how her suicide impacts others, which in real life is obviously impossible. While this fantasy is explored and romanticized, there's a very stark and difficult to watch scene in which they depict her suicide and the emotions her parents deal with upon finding her. This blunt realism serves to pull the viewer out of the romanticized view into the reality of what suicide more closely resembles. However, this scene was removed from the series years later in response to its controversial nature, and what is left, ironically, is a show that romanticizes mental illness more than it would have, which is what most people were complaining about in the first place. It's impossible to measure in its entirety the positive or negative effects on each piece of media because individuals are so different. What might be triggering for some people might be really inspiring or cathartic for others. And my response to calls for censorship is always that more information should be available, not less. We shouldn't remove material or art or expression. We should simply provide more if there's conversations that need to be had about it, or to like teach around pieces of art and so on. Because people who advocate to protect people from speech and art that they don't like oftentimes don't realize the positive elements that they're also shutting out. Like, you could try to do something for a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of people's safety, the ones who are very fragile and just need one more reason to go over the edge, but you're also taking away things that many other people find value and comfort in. And when you're really depressed, maybe it's like kind of the only thing that's keeping you around. And there is a statistical issue with measuring harm besides the fact that it's hard to blame certain behaviors on one particular TV show or change in culture. And that's the fact that it is way more easy to measure harm than it is to measure positive effect. With the exception of more people reaching out to mental health services, which is still a risk management thing, it's hard to quantify the benefit people get from this kind of artwork, versus it's very easy to quantify how many deaths are accounted for in a given period. As human beings, we're naturally hardwired to focus more on the negative aspects of something and to perform risk management rather than look at the possible benefits. And that's why censoring, especially wide bodies of artwork based on some small outside factors, it's really a risky thing to do if you actually care about the positive elements of said artwork. In the same way that I don't think we should ban alcohol for everyone just because some people are alcoholics, I don't think we should get rid of certain art forms just because some people might use it in a negative way. The world will never be a safe place, and trying to pad all of the walls so that way no one gets hurt is actually going to have long-lasting effects on people. But I've talked about that in my extended adolescence video if you want to check that out. And one way this perspective of more information, not less, can be seen is in the aftermath of Kurt Cobain's suicide, whereas other celebrity suicides oftentimes lead to a small spike in suicides. Conversely, there was actually a reduction in the Seattle area where coverage largely focused on treatment for mental health issues and information around it, as well as showing how devastated his family was and all of that kind of thing. It led people to seek out a lot more resources than they would have otherwise, and there was also a decrease in suicides. When you bring something that otherwise isn't broadly talked about, like suicide, into the general public, yes, some people are going to get triggered, but by and large, most people probably need to be reminded of stuff like that in order to open their minds to it and understand what people go through who are dealing with mental illness and depression. And I'll talk a little bit more at the end of how romantic visions of mental illness can actually help you in your emotional development as a person later on in this video. But to really get into the meat of what people are concerned with nowadays, I think when it comes to romanticizing mental illness, I do want to talk about social media, because I think that that's kind of a whole different beast from what we've seen before. The expression of people's mental health on social media has been around since social media itself, most notably in the emo subculture of MySpace. But when most people think of romanticizing mental illness, their minds immediately go to Tumblr, particularly in the 2014 sad girl era. This side of Tumblr was mostly reblogs of TV show characters and singers with sad quotes superimposed on them, or blunt expressions of the sadness people were feeling. There were also images of self-injury, though those were reblogged much less than the more relatable and lighter images and GIFs. And when it comes to vent art in and of itself, I may do a whole other video on this because there is a lot of nuance to it, but basically people have very mixed emotions and reactions to the reign of the sad girl aesthetic, as well as a sort of romanticization of mental illness on Tumblr. I've heard plenty of anecdotes of these subcultures helping people deal with their emotions and cope and find other like-minded people when they can't in broader society, as well as helping them realize that they need to seek professional help. But I've also heard a lot of people who have really gotten sucked into this stuff and wallowed in it much longer than they should have, and maybe kind of tailspin worse than they would have otherwise without all of the peer validation and community building and everything going on. Some people have even claimed that this subculture gave them depression. And in my personal experience, I've found that when I look at this stuff when I'm in a depressed mood, it makes me feel a lot better about myself and a lot more comforted. But I found if I look at this stuff when I'm in a positive mood, yeah, it kind of just makes me sad. There was also a strong presence of pro-anorexia media and eating disorder communities, which are also complicated and nuanced topics to talk about. But when it comes to thinness, even dangerous thinness as an ideal, This has been around in mainstream culture before social media, with heroin chic and the 2000s diet culture as the most recent examples. Thinness found a different format on Tumblr and it became more centered on actual disorders, but honestly, being underweight as an ideal is much more ingrained in our culture than simply as a social media thing, I'm sorry to say. Also, there are popular and glorified beauty standards today that I think are just as bad, if not worse, than the sort of heroin chic stuff we've seen earlier, and that's the complete normalization and promotion of plastic surgery towards young people. I know it's controversial to say, and you could do whatever you want with your own body, but I don't think that's healthy, but only certain sort of glamorizations get a lot of heat, and other ones you're just kind of supposed to accept and let them exist, which, whatever. But by far the best content I've seen whatsoever on eating disorder related issues is of Herbs and Altars channel. You should definitely check that channel out. There's video on meetups before the internet. There's aspects of these pro-ana forums that are not so black and white and so negative. It's oftentimes used as a support group, for instance. But so long as eating disorders exist, people with them are going to find each other and promote that stuff within themselves regardless of the internet. And in my personal experience, as well as within my own friend groups back in the day, yeah, encouraging self-destructive behavior is extremely common within sort of smaller communities. And this isn't to say that these pro-ana forums are a good thing. I'm just saying there's oftentimes a lot of nuance that people just gloss over when talking about these topics, where they just outright demonize it. Sorry, my voice is like cracking, what the heck? But this is something I've even done in a previous video. Granted, it's about the rise of victimhood culture, so of course I'm going to bring this stuff up in a negative light. I criticize the race to the bottom and competitive nature of a lot of these sort of forums. But the fact of the matter is these are really nuanced topics, and not everything is purely bad or purely good, as we've seen all the time throughout our entire lives. But again, an issue I have with a lot of this discourse around romanticizing mental illness is the subjective nature. People all the time will criticize Tumblr posts about how depressed they are, how sad they are, that they want to die, but a lot of these are not romantic images at all. It's literally just sad feelings people have. And so in that case, where is the line of when it becomes romantic? Just because you put a picture in black and white? How is saying that you think no one cares about you just as a text post fine, but as soon as you put like a cigarette in the background, it's like now people are, oh, they're all gonna want to be depressed now. Like, I feel like this is just a topic people become really reactive of without kind of clarifying what it is that they mean, which again is like my biggest issue. But of course, there is the unfortunate aspect that goes with any aesthetic or any subculture, which is that people are going to mimic behavior and things that they see others doing, even if it's not healthy. And there are people out there who will lie about mental illnesses for attention, or they think that mental illness is cool when it's obviously not and horrible. But again, these are people who are searching for an identity. It's normally teenagers who do this. They don't fully know themselves yet, and they see these sad people, and maybe those sad people are getting a lot of attention too. And they're like, hey, you know what? I'm sad sometimes, I should join them. And then one thing leads to another, and now you're copying really bad and self-destructive behaviors. Like, this is a thing that happens as well. I'm not trying to downplay that. And naturally, I hear that this is a way worse problem on TikTok, but you cannot pay me money to download that app. I do not need a 13th reason, okay? Like, I don't need that. But the biggest issue with social media when compared to traditional forms of art and media is the peer-to-peer network, the peer-to-peer relationship aspect, as well as the validation and the likes and so on, because people will obviously do anything for validation. When it comes to social media, your peers are the real influencers. Like, forget celebrities and whatnot, people are mostly affected by what their friends are doing. This obviously happens in real life in high schools as well. You're much more influenced by your friend group than anything else, and your friends are absolutely everything to you at that period of time. But when your communities are online, I imagine the same sort of thing happens. People are much more influenced by the social media posts of their friends than they are of celebrities. And it's unfortunate on social media that these sort of tight-knit communities can sometimes bleed over into the mainstream and affect people who otherwise wouldn't have been affected by it. But it's like, I also don't really know what the solution for this would be. If you're trying to ban these groups, they will find a way. Like, they proliferate on the internet. The internet is a vast place. And again, in real life, people form these kind of groups as well. But in the real world, every single one of us is affected by the mental health and addiction issues of other people. I mean, just walk down downtown LA on the street for 5 minutes and you'll know exactly what I mean. This kind of thing can't be erased in the real world, and so it's unrealistic to expect it to be erased on the internet either. But again, social contagion is a real thing, and friends are influenced by other friends' mental health, and this is just a really complicated Complicated, sticky issue, obviously. In the end, it really comes down to individuals and how you personally use this kind of material and what you create and consume. And so with that being said, I do want to touch on the morality of this phenomenon. Sad art has always been around, and it isn't artists' fault that sad music became popular in the 2010s. There often isn't a rhyme or a reason to a certain trend gaining cultural precedence, although with increases in mental illnesses among young people, it kind of makes sense, and something can have meaning for people for decades while only hitting its popular peak for a few years. Art is also one of the only places where neurosis is helpful and not demonized, which makes it a great tool for creative expression. To me, one of the best aspects of art is it's one of the few places where you can go where you don't feel judged but accepted instead, and it kind of makes you feel better about yourself. I don't think it's immoral to make art depicting mental illness in a beautiful way, but I also don't think art has to bend to a particular moral narrative in general. I think expecting it to do so often results in people censoring themselves and becoming less creative as a result. There's a time and place for everything. And it's fine when people criticize romanticization by explaining what mental illness is really like, but that doesn't mean romanticization should never exist, or even that it's purely harmful. You can't control how other people interpret art, and to some what is offensive or triggering is a coping mechanism for someone else. Artists are also not responsible for people who use their work irresponsibly. People are often drawn to the tragic because it represents darker aspects of humanity that we have a psychological need to come to terms with, or to at least recognize to some degree. And with that, I want to talk about how romanticized art, or even the sad girl aesthetic, can be a useful element in your emotional development as a human being. Now, I am by no means an expert on mental health, and I cannot tell you how to become mentally healthy. If I could, my life would look very different. But while I hope one day to have positive mental health, the sad girl era or sad girl aesthetic, etc., that part of me is not something that I can ever fully get rid of. It is a part of myself that I'll eventually have to come to terms with and make peace to, so it doesn't control me as my shadow. I find a lot of people shaming their former selves for the content that they used to consume while still struggling with poor mental health, and I just don't think that it's healthy to be that frustrated or angry at a part of who you were when you were 16 years old. And when it comes to recovering from mental illness or from an eating disorder, it's normal to have elements of nostalgia for that time in your life, even if it was mostly really painful and terrible, and that's where romanticization kind of comes in. In the same way that people can have a nostalgic cry over heartbreak music even while they're in a healthy relationship, people who have recovered mentally can still kind of look back at their old selves and feel some kind of nostalgia for what they used to deal with and what they went through, particularly if that was kind of your entire youth. I think people view certain communities and aesthetics as a siren's call back to their old way of being, and certainly some people do use this stuff to trigger themselves purposefully. This also isn't always the case, and I think it can be really helpful to compartmentalize your feelings as much as is possible when looking back on past things, so you could see them from a more detached and less emotional viewpoint. And it can also kind of help you deal with those elements of your past, particularly the more romantic kind of nostalgic, film grainy kind of aspects. It also makes sense that this kind of material is popular because even if you're not clinically depressed, a lot of people go through a depressive episode at some point in their lives. And when it comes to healthy people, I think sad art and aesthetics can really help them identify the more negative emotions, and it doesn't mean that those emotions are going to overtake them. It's just a healthy aspect of who you are, and coming to terms with that and be able to see what it looks like, feels like, be able to name it in some way, I think that could be extraordinarily healthy. But I also want to talk about this quote from psychologist Jay Jotako from a very long time ago, and yes, I pronounced that name wrong. She said, "Mental states have a life of their own. They strive to live and develop fully. This being their aims, they fight inextricably, the winner triumphing. Those states cannot coexist without struggling in our consciousness, which always represents one whole, but whose field of vision is limited to one spot. The aim of that fight is to assure the very best functioning of mental activities by perfecting its elements and the victory of the strongest." Romanticism in art is just one aspect of the expression of this complicated emotion and of complicated illnesses, and we need to keep in mind that when it comes to a topic as broad as mental health, not every show or TV show or movie can get it all right, show all elements of it. Every form of art requires editing. You take certain aspects out and you focus on other ones, and the romantic feelings some people have around their suffering, that sense of identity, the ontological security I talked about before, those romanticized aspects are just one part of your emotional feeling and expression. And as long as there's room for all kinds of art, having romanticized art shouldn't really be that big of a deal. One of the best aspects of art, as well as the internet, is that it's all communication. People have different perspectives that they can kind of crystallize and put forth, and certain aspects of a feeling or emotion that they could put forth. And because it's part of a larger network of conversation and dialogue, you can get a sense of all these different aspects of who we are as people. It's actually very complicated and complex. I think it's also important to remember that recovery is really complicated and not everyone is ready to recover. And as a part of recovery, sometimes relapse is necessary as well, and that's why all aspects of an emotional experience should be expressed. It's only once you're through an era that you can stop, reflect, and learn and kind of gain a narrative around everything that was going on. And when it comes to working yourself out of certain sort of feelings or situations that you find yourself in for too long, it could actually be really chaotic and confusing and scary, and you might need to rely as a crutch on your old ways of being until you're fully ready to continue on. If you're coming out of a depression, you might be feeling all these kinds of moods and mood swings and rapid changes and anger and all this stuff going on, and that's a lot to deal with. It makes sense to kind of have nostalgia or to look back a bit on some of your more melancholic ways of being in order to kind of stabilize in a more steady sort of way. But personally, I think sad art, melancholy art, all of that kind of stuff, even romanticized views of art, when used correctly, can be an important part of your development as a human, and it also kind of provides a lot of other ways to explain how you felt. So that way, if you are able to compartmentalize your feelings and your stages of life, you can see more fully the scope of what that looked like, that feeling and that state of being looked like. And so in that sense, I'm glad that sad art exists. I know it's a complicated and nuanced topic. Again, this is just one perspective on this. I have not seen a video thus far defending romanticized mental illness in art or anything like it. It's all people kind of piling on this thing as something to be shamed, which is certainly understandable, and there's a lot of really valid criticisms there. But I also think in order to kind of understand this phenomenon in a more whole sense, you need to be able to see the opposition side as well. And if you guys know my channel, you know I'm extremely passionate about free speech. I would never, ever, ever tell someone what kind of art they're allowed to make, what kind of art they're allowed to consume, or what kind of things they're allowed to say or believe. That just completely would go against my moral compass. But anyways, that is my video. Let me know your thoughts down below. I know this one was heavy. I'm sure YouTube will probably age restrict it, which will suck. But I am curious your guys' thoughts on this topic. I'm going to be talking a lot about art and mental health in some upcoming videos, so stay tuned for that. And if you're subscribed to me, then I will see you in the next video. Bye.